Division, July 8, 1947. A flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. It's been inspected at Roswell, New Mexico. Deadline Division, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. Army officers say the missile found...
The nightmare of the creature I saw at Fort Riley never faded from my memory. Although I was able to bury it during my years as a guided missile commander in Europe, I never saw its body again the rest of my life, except for the autopsy photos and the medical examiner's sketches that would catch up to me along with the rest of what happened at Roswell. When I returned to Washington from Germany for assignment at the Pentagon in 1961, I can remember my first day back when I was waiting outside my boss's door for entry to the intersanctum. And boy, was I nervous. The last time I remembered being that nervous in Washington, I was standing in a little corridor outside the Oval Office in the White House waiting for President Eisenhower to get off the phone. I had a big request to make, and I wanted to do it face to face, not go through any aides or assistants or wait for Special Assistant C.D. Jackson to show up to make everything okay. I was almost a regular in the Oval Office those days back in the 1950s, dropping off National Security Council staff papers for the president making reports, and sometimes waiting while he read them just in case he wanted me to relay any messages. I was asking President Eisenhower for a personal favor, to let me out of my 5th year on the White House National Security staff so I could pick up the command of my own anti-aircraft guided missile battalion being formed up in Red Canyon, New Mexico. Ike had once promised me a command of my own when I returned from Korea and was posted to the White House. Those were my memories this afternoon as I stood outside the back door of General Trudeau's office on the 3rd floor of the outer ring of the Pentagon. It was 1961, 4 years after I left the White House and put on my uniform again to stand guard across the electronic no man's land of radar sweeps and photo sensors just a few kilometers west of the Iron Curtain. I was lieutenant colonel when I came to the Pentagon in 1961, and all I brought with me were my Bolin trophies from Fort Riley and a nameplate for my desk cut out of the fin of a Nike missile from Germany. My men made it for me and said it would bring me luck. After I got to the Pentagon, it was still a couple of days before my assignment actually began. I found out right away I'd need a lot of it. In fact, as I opened the door and let myself directly into the general's inner office, I found out how much luck I'd need that very day. So what's the big secret, General? I asked my new boss. It was strange talking to a general this way, but we'd become friends while I was on Eisenhower's staff. Why not the front door? He says, because they're already watching you, Phil. He said, knowing exactly what kind of cold chill that would send through me. And I'd just as soon have this conversation in private before you show up officially. He walked me over to a set of file cabinets. Things haven't changed that much around here since you went to Germany, he said. We still know who our friends are and who we can trust. So General Trudeau gave me this very grim smile and said as he walked me toward the locked, dark, olive military file cabinet on the wall of his private office, I need you to cover my back. Okay, think about that, guys. The General Trudeau is walking Corso over to this olive military file cabinet on the wall, okay, at his private office or in his private office, and he says, I need you to cover my back. I need you to watch because what I'm going to do, I can't cover it myself. Whatever Trudeau was planning, I knew he'd tell me in his own time, and he'd tell me only what he thought I needed to know and when I needed to know it. For the immediate present, I was to be his special assistant in R&D, one of the most sensitive divisions in the whole Pentagon bureaucracy, because that was where the most classified plans of the scientists and weapons designers were translated into the reality of defense contracts. Phil, General Trudeau continued as he put his hand on top of the cabinet. I'm going to have this cabinet moved downstairs to your office. The general had put me in an office on the second floor of the outer ring directly under him. This way, as I would soon find out, whenever he needed me in a hurry, I could get upstairs and through the back door before anyone even knew I was there. This has some special files, war material you've never seen before that I want you to put under your foreign technology responsibilities, he continued. My specific assignment was to the Research and Development Division's Foreign Technology Desk, what I thought would be a pretty dry post because it mainly required me to keep up on the kinds of weapons and research our allies were doing, read the intelligence reports, review films of weapons tests, debrief scientists and the research people at universities on what their colleagues overseas were doing, and write up the proposals for weapons the Army might need. I couldn't help but pick up the nervousness in his voice, forcing itself through his laughter, the same sound over the phone that got me nervous when I heard it the first time. There really was something here he was not telling me. Is there something else about this I should know, General? He's asking the general. I asked, trying not to show any hesitation in my voice. Business as usual, nothing out of the ordinary. Actually, Phil, the material in this cabinet is a little different. Okay, here's where it starts to get good, guys. Okay, the material in this cabinet is a little different from the run-of-the-mill foreign stuff we've seen up to now, he said. I don't know if you've ever seen the intelligence on what we've got here when you were over at the White House, but before you write up any summaries, maybe you should do a little research on the Roswell file. Now, I'd heard more about Roswell than I was ready to admit right on the spot my first day at the Pentagon. And there was more wild stories floating around about Roswell and what we were still doing there than anyone could have imagined. So again, he's talking about his time at the R&D, wild stories floating around the R&D back in the Army. Okay, let's continue. But I hadn't made the connection between the Roswell files and what was in the cabinet General Trudeau was talking about. Basically, I had hoped after Fort Riley that it would all go away and I could simply bury my head in the sand and worry about things I could get my brain around, like bureaucratic infighting inside Washington, instead of little aliens inside sealed coffins. The general didn't wait for me to answer him. He left me standing there in his office and walked out to the reception room where I had heard him giving orders into a speakerphone. He had barely clicked off the speaker and walked back to where I was standing when 4 enlisted men pulling a hand truck, okay, basically pulling a dolly, showed up, saluted, and stood there in attention while Trudeau kept looking at me. He didn't say anything. He turned to the enlisted men. Instead, load up this cabinet on that dolly and follow Corso to his office on the second floor. Now remember, Trudeau's on the third floor, Corso on the second floor. Don't stop for anybody. Don't talk to anybody. If anybody stops you, you tell them to come see me. That's an order. They loaded the file cabinet onto the dolly as if there were nothing inside, pulled it towards the back door, and stared at me until I followed them out. Not too much time, Trudeau called out after me as we went out the door and down the hall. I remember I spent quite a while just looking at that cabinet after it was loaded off the dolly and set up in my inner office. There was almost an ominous quality, almost an ominous quality to it that just belied its quiet official Army presence. So I must confess that given the reverse hype of the general's introduction, part of me wanted to tear it open right away as if it were a present on Christmas morning, but the part of me that won just let it sit there protected until I figured out what to do with it. I was thinking about what General Trudeau had said about Roswell and the amount of paperwork that had circulated through the White House when I was on the national security staff there. No, I wasn't going to review the Roswell files, not just yet, not until I took a long, hard look at what was inside the file cabinet. So he's referring to the artifacts. He's saying he's not going to read the files first, is what I'm guessing here. He wants to, check out the artifacts, the headband, and so forth. Not just yet. No, or he goes on to say, not until I took a hard look at what was inside the file cabinet, but even that was going to wait until the rest of my office was set up. Whatever I was supposed to do, I wanted to do it right. I spent a little more time pacing around my new office while I thought some more about what the general said. Why was this file waiting for me in his private office? And why had he wanted to talk to me specifically about it? It also wasn't lost on me that I had not seen one scrap of paper from the general covering this delivery of the material to me, nor my receipt of it. So remember, this is the Pentagon. There's a paper trail for everything. So what he's saying is, why wasn't there a paper trail? It could have just easily been that the file cabinet didn't even exist, as far as I knew. Only his eyes and soon my eyes would review it. So whatever it was serious, only if by omission very, very secret. I remember a hot July night 14 years before at Fort Riley when I was the young intelligence officer after having just been shipped back from Rome. I remember being hustled into a storage hangar by one of the sentries and fellow member of the Fort Riley bowling team. What he pointed to under the thick olive tarp that night was also very, very secret. Okay, anytime they talk about a tarp, we know where they're going, guys, right? Okay, he goes on to say, and I held my breath hoping that what was inside this cabinet wasn't anything like what I saw that night in Kansas, July 9th, 1947. I opened the cabinet and almost immediately my heart sank. I knew from looking at the shoebox of tangled wires and little strange cloths from the visor-like headpiece and the little wafers that looked like Ritz crackers, only with broken edges and colored a dark gray, and from an assortment of other items that I couldn't even relate to the shapes and sizes of things I was familiar with, that my life was headed for a big, big change. Back in Kansas that night, July 1st, I told myself that I was seeing an illusion, something that if I wished really hard didn't have to exist for me. Then, after I went to the White House and saw all the National Security Council memos describing the air quote incident and talking about the package and the goods, I knew that the strange figure I'd seen floating in a liquid in a casket within a casket at Fort Riley wasn't just a bad dream I could forget about. Nor could I forget about the radar anomalies at the Red Canyon Missile Range or the strange alerts over the Ramstein Air Base in West Germany. I only hoped all of it would never catch up with me again and I could go through the rest of my Army career in some kind of peace, but it was not to be. There, mangled like somebody else's junk, were these trinkets I knew would involve me in something deeper than I'd ever wanted. Whatever else I had to do in this life, here was a job that would change it all. everything was about to change. General Trudeau peeked his head around the door. "Look inside," he asked. "What'd you do to me, General?" I said. "I thought we were friends." The general says, "That's why I gave you this, Phil," he said, but he wasn't laughing. He wasn't even smiling. "You know how valuable this property is? You know what any of the other agencies would do to get their hands on this? They'd probably kill me," I said. "They'd probably want to kill you anyway. But this makes them even more rabid. The Air Force wants it because they think it belongs to them. The Navy wants it because they want anything the Air Force wants. The CIA wants it so they can give it to the Russians. What do you want me to do, General?" I asked. I couldn't figure out what he was thinking unless he thought I should just bury the stuff and leave it at that. "I need a plan from you," he said. "Not simply what the property is, but what we can do with it, something that keeps it out of play until we know what we have and what we can use or make of it." This had all the makings of a plot, pure and simple. "Look, who's our biggest problem?" I asked, but it was a pro forma question because I already knew the answer. "The same people who lost Korea for us and who you and I had to fight over at the White House," he said. "You know exactly who I mean. We got," wow, that's kind of, well, if you guys know the history, you know what he means by that. But he goes on to say, "We have to keep whatever's valuable here from falling into the wrong hands, because as sure as we're standing in the Pentagon, it'll find its way right to the Kremlin. We have to know what we have first," I said. "Then that's your job right away. What do we have? Anything usable here, put together people you can trust from the specialists we have, and go over the contacts at our defense contractor list. And this is only part of the property we have." Let me reread that, guys. This is Trudeau telling Corso. "And this is only part of the property we have. There's some more of it downstairs in the file basement that the other intelligence agencies don't know anything about. Came here from New Mexico instead of going out to Ohio. Don't ask me why. It's coming up to you right now in boxes. Just put everything together, take some time, and evaluate this for me." So he's saying he has this file in his office right now. He's kind of gone through it a little bit. But now there's other artifacts and files in the basement coming up to the third floor of the Pentagon right now. He says there's some more of it downstairs in the file basement that the other intelligence agencies don't know anything about. Came here from New Mexico, speaking of Roswell, instead of going out to Ohio. Don't ask me why. It's coming up to you right now in boxes. Just put everything together, take some time, and evaluate this for me. I didn't take the file apart that night, even after another nondescript wooden crate that looked like something you ship vegetables in was carted to my office by an equally nondescript Army corporal. I didn't go through the material the next night either, but over the following week, whenever I could be sure that no one was around who could pop in without warning, I moved the material from the box into the file and allowed myself time to look at it. It was just like falling through the looking glass into a different world. Wow. Just like falling through the looking glass into a different world. A puzzle of separate pieces that only vaguely captured what had been in the memos I'd read over at the White House. No wonder no one had really wanted anything to do with this junk, which held the promise of a whole world we knew nothing about, but that as far back as 1947, the government had decided to keep it an absolute secret. First, there were the tiny, clear, single-filament, flexible glass-like wires twisted together through a kind of gray harness as if they were cables going through a junction. They were narrow filaments thinner than copper wires as I held the harness of strands up to the light from my desk. So right now he's basically checking this stuff out, and he's kind of describing what he's seeing. I could see an eerie glow coming through them as if they were conducting the faint light and breaking it up into colors. When the personnel at the retrieval site in the desert outside of Roswell pulled the piece out of the wreckage of the delta-shaped object, okay, that's a big one there, okay, the delta-shaped object, they thought it was some sort of wiring device. A harness is what they said. Or maybe some of them thought it was a junction box or electrical relay, but whatever they thought it was, they believed there was nothing like it on this planet. As I turned the object over in my hand, I figured from the way the individual filaments flexed back and forth but didn't break, and the way they were able to conduct a light beam along their length, they were a wire of some sort. But for what purpose, I didn't have a clue. Okay, so let me pause for a minute just to kind of, fill you guys in. I know it might be a little bit difficult to keep up with what is happening here. So now Corso is starting to go through the boxes, through the files, and he's beginning to reveal what he's looking at, what he's discovering. I'm going to go back just a little bit. He says, first, there were the tiny, clear, single filament, flexible glass-like wires twisted together through a kind of gray harness as if they were cables going into a junction. They were narrow filaments, thinner than copper wire. As I held the harness or strands up to the light from my desk, I could see the eerie glow coming through them. Okay, so again, he's describing what he's seen, conducting the faint light and breaking it up into different colors. Okay, so let's continue. Then, again, he's describing what he's seen here in these files, these crates, these boxes. Then there were the thin 2-inch around matte gray oyster cracker-shaped wafers of a material that looked like plastic but had tiny road maps of wires barely raised etched along the surface. They were the size of a 25-cent piece, so the size of a quarter. But the etchings on the surface reminded me of squashed insects with their 100 legs spread out at right angles from a flat body. Okay, so he's saying that basically the size of a quarter, and it had these tiny little lines all over it that looked like, a spider or a bug that had been squashed. Okay, it was a circuit. Anyone could figure that out by 1961, especially when you put it under a magnifying glass. But from the way these wafers were stacked on each other, okay, that's very important to remember, the way these wafers were stacked on each other, this was a circuitry unlike any other I'd ever seen. I couldn't figure out how to plug it in and what kind of current it carried, but it was clearly a wire circuitry of some sort that came from a larger board of wafers on board the flying craft. My hands shook ever so slightly as I held the pieces, not because they themselves were scary, but because I was awed, just for a few seconds, about the momentaneous nature of this find. It was like an architectural treasure trove and discoveries of some long-departed culture, a Rosetta Stone. Even through whoever crashed into the desert floor was still very active and roaming around our most secret Army and Air Force bases. I was most interested in the file descriptions accompanying a 2-piece set of dark elliptical eyepieces. Whoa, what? I was most interested in the file descriptions accompanying a 2-piece set of dark elliptical eyepieces as thin as skin. The Walter Reed pathologist said they adhered to the lenses of the extraterrestrial creature's eyes and seemed to reflect existing light, even in what looked like complete darkness, so as to illuminate and intensify images in the darkness to allow their wearer to pick out shapes. So what is he saying here? Is he referring to night vision, or is he saying that this was some type of lens, like a contact lens that the alien would wear? It says the Walter Reed pathologist said they adhered to the lenses of the extraterrestrial creature's eyes and seemed to reflect existing light. So yeah, like sunglasses. Even in what looked like complete darkness, so to illuminate and intensify images in the darkness to allow the wearer to pick out shapes. I mean, this is crazy, guys. So let me continue. Wow. There was a dull, grayish, silver foil-like swatch of cloth among these artifacts that you could not fold, bend, tear, or wad up. Now, remember that. You remember the rancher, how he was talking about you try to fold it or crumble it and it would go back to its natural shape, like memory metal, these different alien alloys. So he goes on, that you could not fold, bend, tear, or wad up, but that bounded, or there we go, bounded right back into its original shape without any creases. It was a metallic fiber with physical characteristics that would later be called super tenacity. But when I tried to cut it with scissors, the arms just slid right off without making even a nick in the fibers. If you tried to stretch it, it bounced back. But I noticed that all the threads seemed to be going in one direction. When I tried to stretch it widthwise instead of lengthwise, it looked like the fibers had reoriented themselves to the direction I was pulling in. This couldn't be cloth, but it obviously was not metal. It was a combination, to my unscientific eye, of a cloth woven with metal strands that had the drape and malleability of a fabric and the strength and resistance of a metal. I was on top of some of the most secret weapons projects at the Pentagon, and we had nothing like this even under the wish list category. I mean, this is crazy, guys. So he's going through this and saying, even at the Pentagon and all these different projects, this was like their wish list, like their dream to have this type of alien alloys and artifacts. So let's continue. There was a written description and a sketch of another device too, like a short stubby flashlight, almost with a self-contained power source that was nothing at all like a battery. The scientist at Wright Field who examined it said they couldn't see the beam of light shoot out of it, but when they pointed the pencil-like flashlight at the wall, they could see a tiny circle of red light. But there was no actual beam from the end of what seemed like a lens to the wall, as there would have been if you were playing a flashlight off a distant object. When they passed an object in front of the source of light, it interpreted it. But the beam was so intense the object began smoking. Now, you guys probably already aware that they are referring to laser beams, I believe. Okay, let's continue. They played with this device a lot before they realized that it was an alien cutting device like a blowtorch. One time they floated some smoke across the light and suddenly the whole beam took shape. Again, they're talking about lasers. Again, this is 1960s, guys. They didn't know. What had been invisible suddenly had a round, micro-thin, tunnel-like shape. Why did the inhabitants of this craft have a cutting device like this aboard their ship? It wasn't until later when I read military reports of cattle mutilations in which entire organs were removed without any visible trauma to the surrounding cell tissue. Then I realized that the light beam cutting torch I thought was in the Roswell file was actually a surgical implement, just like a scalpel, that was being used by aliens in their medical experiments on our livestock. But when they pointed the pencil-like flashlight at the wall, they could see a tiny circle of red light, but there was no actual beam from the end of what seemed like a lens to the wall, as there would have been if you were playing a flashlight off of a distant object. When they passed an object in front of the source of light, it interrupted it, but the beam was so intense the object began smoking. Now, guys, think about this. What are they talking about? They're talking about lasers. Again, this was back in 1961, I believe. So, these types of things didn't exist back then. Okay, let's continue. They played with this device a lot before they realized that it was an alien cutting device like a blowtorch. Wow. One time, they floated some smoke across the light, and suddenly the whole beam took shape. What had been invisible suddenly had a round, micro-thin, tunnel-like shape to it. Why did the inhabitants of this craft have a cutting device like this aboard their ship? Okay, I think they're hinting towards the cattle mutilations and things like that. Where, of course, we find livestock with these surgical laser precision cuts. And I think this is what, he's kind of hinting towards, is what I'm guessing. Then there was the strangest device of all, a headband almost with electrical single pickup devices on either side. I could figure out no use for this thing whatsoever unless whoever used it did so as a fancy hairband. It seemed to be a one-size-fits-all headpiece that did nothing, at least not for humans. Maybe it picked up brain waves like an electrocephalogram, whatever that is, and projected and projected a chart, but no private experiment conducted on it seemed to do anything at all. Now, if you guys follow the channel, you know we've kind of covered the headband chapter 11. Check out my last video. Then he goes on to say, Corso, the scientists didn't even determine how to plug it in or what its source of power was because it came with no batteries or diagrams. There were nights I'd spread these articles all around me as if they were indeed Christmas presents. And I could imagine, guys, I would be so excited, thrilled to be going through this stuff. And again, you have to remember, this isn't 2022, 2023. This is back in the 1960s when all of this was alien tech, lasers, circuit boards, night vision, things like that. These different headbands now known as autopilot. So you just have to kind of remember the time frame or the era this is coming from, the 1960s. There were nights where I'd just take one thing out and turn it around until I almost memorized what it looked like from different angles before putting it back. These days were passing, and without having been told directly by Trudeau, I knew that he was getting anxious. We'd sit in meetings together when other people were around, and he couldn't say anything. I could almost hear his insides burst. There were times when we were alone, and Trudeau almost didn't want to broach our shared secret. Army R&D had stewardship over these bits and pieces of foreign technology from Roswell. How long would we have them? I did not know. So over a late night pot of coffee in General Trudeau's office, he decided that we would move this material out to defense contractors, out to where scientists would see it, and where under the guise of top secrecy, it would be in the system before the CIA could stow it, where no one would find it except for the very people we were trying to hide it from. This is the devil's plan, General, I said to Trudeau that night. It wasn't until later when I read the military reports of cattle mutilations in which entire organs were removed without any
You're the one who's going to get away with it. I'll just kick them off your back
that I realized
long enough until you do.
Torch, I thought
now, all I could do was
Roswell
think about
file was
what I'd seen that night in
surgical
1947,
instrument, just
and
like a
worse,
scalpel
what
that
in
was
the
being
world
used
was I
by
going
the
to do with all
aliens
this
in
stuff
medical
next? I'd ask
experiments
myself,
on
why
our
me?
livestock? Hundreds of times since that night in the Pentagon, and asked why after 14 years and my experience at Fort Riley, I had to become the inheritor of the Roswell file. I sometimes think he believed I must have had some experience with alien encounters and wouldn't be spooked by working with the technology from the Roswell file. I never asked him about it, as strange as that seems, because the military being what it is, you don't ask, you simply do. So now and then, I don't question. I only remember that I went forward from that night to put into development as much of the Roswell files as I could, and believed that whatever happened, I was doing the right thing. Okay, so there you have it. That is the ending of Chapter 3, The Roswell Artifacts. Now, let me just give you a few quick thoughts off the top of my head. Didn't take notes, just kind of brainstorm here. I think it's very interesting when they talk about the technology that was recovered from the Roswell crash site. He's talking about lasers. He's talking about body armor. He's talking about circuit boards, and I believe spandex at one point, bulletproof vests, all these different things that back then they had no idea what it was. But of course today, it's very common. I mean, probably anyone listening out there, you have something from the Roswell crash in your home, something that you use today. So I found that very interesting. And it made me think, okay, was this alien tech, or was this something from humans, like something man-made, because we know, the military, Roswell, DARPA, all these agencies, they're always 10, 15, 20 years ahead of the tech that the public is aware of. I mean, think of, the stealth technology and things like that. So it just, when I was reading this earlier, I started kind of thinking to myself, I wonder, was this one of our crafts, or was it alien? Honestly, I don't know yet. I'm not really convinced one way or the other. Or was it a hybrid? You know, I mean, again, guys, this is why the Roswell mystery is so fascinating, you know, because really it always leaves you with more questions than answers. And I love that. And it's a rabbit hole. You know, I've gone down this rabbit hole, this journey now for years. I mean, over a decade. But this book by far has been the best. You know, so that's just something I wanted to say. And another thing is, you know, I like how this book is so detailed, right? I mean, all of the details, the information, you know, the small things like, you know, saying that he was on the 3rd floor, General Trudeau was on the 2nd floor directly below his office. I mean, the color, the military olive green file cabinet. I mean, just this amazing detail that Corso goes into, you know, I don't think you can make that up. And, you know, and here's the thing. Let me just close. Look, guys, I'm so excited. I love the Roswell mystery. I could talk about this forever. But here's what I want to say in closing to this chapter, rather. If just one of these things are true, right? Just one, then that means there's something out there, something other than humans. There's some type of ET life if we can just prove one of these things. Now, I understand the debate. The debate is, well, again, like I just said, what if it's reverse engineered? And in the 1960s, they've never heard of this. So again, it's a fascinating debate. But I think if just one of these things, if we can confirm it, if we can validate it, you know, an alien alloy or just something, some type of off-planet tech, then we can prove that the Roswell mystery is real.